But for now, I guess really just tell us a little about yourself, what you do in the industry, how long you've been in the industry for.
Okay, Ian Eisenberg. I own Uncle Ike's. We're a retail operator in Seattle. We have 4 stores right now and a 5th that's opening probably 2 weeks. The first store opened. We're the 2nd store in Seattle, and we opened in September 2013. About 140 employees. Yeah.
And
typical retailer.
when it comes to the regulatory body of the cannabis industry in Washington, that's the Washington Cannabis and Liquor Board, right?
Yep.
How would you describe them as a regulator? What would you describe your relationship to them as a cannabis business owner? What have your employees said about them as a regulatory body?
It all depends when you'd ask me that question. If you'd asked me that question a year or 2 ago, and I would say it's a pretty antagonistic relationship. It's gotten a whole lot better. They've made some changes and things are pretty good now. They were thrown into regulating us, the cannabis, when it was legalized without really any experience. Nobody had any experience in it. But in my personal opinion, without a budget. They're also responsible for our seed to sale tracking system, which hasn't worked in over a year here. And it's just, there's no budget for it. So there's no operator that wants to do it. So mainly from my side, from a retailer's perspective, the LCB's focus is mainly enforcement of laws that the consumers see, the customer sees. So age enforcement, safety, the size of our signs, nitpicky things like that. What they do on the producer processor side, of course, is completely different. And every state the setup is so different. Like in the Washington, there's no testing a product on the LCB side, really. And the biggest difference between us and Colorado, of course, is that we're not vertically integrated. We're not allowed to grow or process. We're only allowed to sell.
Who does the cultivation and the processing then?
There's 3 tiers of licenses. There's a producer, there's a processor, and there's a retailer. You can be a producer and processor, but if you're one of those 2, you can't be a retailer. So it's like liquor laws in certain states where you couldn't brew beer and sell beer.
Yeah, I'm from Texas. I understand those laws now. Yeah.
I think in Colorado, when they first opened, didn't you have to grow 70 or 80% of what you sold in the store?
I wouldn't know. I've never lived in Colorado.
Oh,
I've only visited a couple times. Well, and would you say when it comes to easy to work with, a lot of people here say the Department of Taxation, they're almost never on the same wavelength as the cannabis employees and the cannabis businesses themselves. So would you say they're an easier regulatory body to handle? I remember you said, over the course of a couple of years, your relationship has changed.
I have a little bit of a theory on that, because most people would say, no, they're not easy to work with. But a lot of people in cannabis, they're young, and this is their first business, especially their first business dealing with a government oversight. No government agency is easy to work with in any industry.
Amen to that. Yeah.
And it's just, but if you've never done that before, you don't know how bad the government is not bad, but how bad a bureaucracy is in a lot of cases. And when the LCB started, up until a year ago, the officers that would come out and check our stores for labeling issues or signage issues were the same officers that checked the liquor stores, the grocery stores, the bars, the hair salons that sold wine. So they were running around checking on really, really different industries. And as a result, they weren't that much of an expert of the rules of any of them, especially the cannabis laws and rules that change all the time. So you'd talk to 3 different enforcement officers and you'd get 3 different rulings. And it was total chaos. At one point, I think we had 4 different enforcement officers, and each one would tell us something totally different. Over the past couple of years, the LCB has, they divided it up where liquor is liquor and cannabis is cannabis. So now the cannabis enforcement officers really know what they're doing, and they're great. We have no problem at all. The advertising enforcement was one of the toughest issues, and really nobody knew how to enforce the laws because lawmakers wrote them. And a lot of times when a lawmaker writes a law in any industry, it takes years before it gets interpreted by agency, by staff, and by the courts to what it really means, because it's very ambiguous. And that's what we were dealing with. But now the LCB has one person who deals with the advertising rules, and he is an expert, and he's great. So, it's been 5 years since cannabis has been legal here, and that sounds like a long time to get, things like the LCB, Liquor and Cannabis Board, to work more efficiently. But I think in terms of a government bureaucracy, 5 years is a wink of an eye. So they're probably doing better than most people would give them credit for. And I'm a little bit of a LCB apologist in this aspect. A lot of people in the industry would just say that they're the enemy.
Understand. And so what I mainly wanted to touch about was the agent card process. So I called a few dispensaries in Washington and asked them, is there any equivalent to the agent card, the MED badge, the state issued license that hourly employees, not just the business owners, that hourly employees need to work in this industry. And calling the dispensaries in Washington, I saw that there's almost no equivalent. So what do dispensaries, cultivators, cannabis businesses do? What do they do to background check their employees, to vet them, to make sure that, there's no any outstanding crimes or anything like that? Because that's what the agent card process is supposed to do, among many other supposed actions.
There is no training program for bud tenders or cultivators. Some shops are medically endorsed and some are adult use, some are both. The medical doesn't really exist here. There's 1 or 2 producers in the whole state that grow medical pot. And the only difference of it is the legal definition and somehow it's grown. So it's a lot more expensive. And a medical customer only, they don't have to pay the sales tax, but they still have to pay the sin tax. So really, why do it? Your selection is a lot smaller. If you're a medical bud tender, there's an online course, or you go into a class for a couple of days. It's really easy. But for everybody else, for adult use, there's no licensing. There was a few bills that people have tried to pass that would require a licensing, similar to alcohol server permits. But the big difference is alcohol servers, I've taken that class, it's mainly about over-serving a customer in a bar. And because there's no public consumption of cannabis, it doesn't really make sense. And so there is none. In terms of background checks, that's up to the individual pot store. Like, we do background checks on all employees, but if you have, there's no law saying if you have a felony, you can't work in a pot shop. We have a lot of employees that have criminal histories, and we kind of like to hire, people that have a hard time getting a job.
Because, that's especially an issue that I brought up in the first episode, was that Nevada tries to be the most progressive cannabis industry in the country, yet they're making felons wait 10 years before working in the industry.
Is that to work in the industry or to get a license?
To get the agent card. If you committed a felony 10 years before, at any time, then you're ineligible. It has to be 10 years since that felony conviction.
To just work in a dispensary?
Yes,
that's crazy.
Cultivator. Yeah, that's why I'm doing this project, is because I want to show the state of Nevada that, no, you're not the gold standard when it comes to cannabis regulation. You're barely even the bronze, We have a lot of employees that have histories, and some of them for dealing pot issues.
The only time we wouldn't hire somebody, I guess if they had a violent crime, we'd look at it carefully and evaluate it, child issues. But no, it's not an issue in Washington State.
That's interesting, yeah, because, coming from a heavily regulated state like this, just seeing a state that has no agent cards, that their regulatory body is meant specifically for the cannabis industry. Here it's all done until July 1st, apparently, by the Department of Taxation.
To get a license here, there's a criminal check. And it's a point system where a felony is so many points and misdemeanor is so many points. And the points drop off your record after a certain number of years. But I know a lot of people with felonies that have licenses in the state.
Wow. How many years do you have to wait if you do have a felony on your record before you get that cultivation or production license?
I don't remember. I think you're allowed to. I don't remember. I'd be guessing. But
Okay.
10 years is the max. Everything's gone after 10 years. But then it's sort of a sliding scale. I think that when we opened, I think that the initiative was largely written by a staff from the ACLU, and it had a real focus on social justice issues, and it was probably more fair. Like some states, you have to post a bond, you have to be a certain size, certain capitalization rates. In this state, to get a retail license, it was a lottery, a $250 buy-in straight lottery. Anybody could get a cultivation or processing license. The point system for criminal history was pretty loose, I think, compared to other states. I think Washington State did everything pretty well, maybe the best in the nation in that aspect.
So you said the ACLU wrote up not the regulations, just
no, but the initiative, the voter initiative, I-502.
Okay.
Allison Holcomb worked at the ACLU at the time, and she was really the one that helped push it through.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I
don't know who wrote our initiative, but I doubt it was the ACLU, given how non-progressive it is.
Yeah, what's interesting about pot, when I read an article about why people voted for cannabis legalization in the state, and it was overwhelming to right past wrongs about the war on drugs and racial inequities. It was not because people wanted legal pot.
No.
I don't think it would have won. I don't think it would have passed the state if it was based on legal pot.
Wow. And the last question I wanted to ask was, as someone who's well employed in the cannabis industry in Washington, who's worked in it for many years, do you feel the state of Washington has some kind of advantage over the other legal states, whether that be economic, whether that be regulatory, whether that be social justice oriented?
The biggest difference here is there's a lot more diversity in product. You think about no vertical integration. I remember if you go to a lot of states, you go into a dispensary, and almost everything they're selling is stuff they grow. If you go into a dispensary here, there's a lot more options, a lot more products, a lot more diversity of products. There's just probably 10 times more SKUs on the wall. There's a lot more small operators in the state as a result of that. So the craft aspect of the industry is huge here compared to other places. There's another big difference here. We don't allow out-of-state ownership. You have to be a Washington State resident to own a license. So you don't have the big, the public companies, the Forefront, that's a bad example, the direct ownership from public companies like MedMen or any of these big Harvest, any of these huge chains. They might own part of the company in terms of IP or real estate, but they don't own the license. So there's a lot of small operators here. And I think the craft aspect of the industry is what makes our marketplace different than others. And it also it's a bonanza for the consumer. There's more products, and because there's more competition to get on retailer shelves, the prices are lower. So even with the highest taxation, I think, in the country, 47% tax, I think we still have the lowest prices.
You said 47% tax in total?
We have 37% sin tax, and then about 10% sales tax.
Wow, what is the sin tax?
It's an excise tax, but
Excise?
People call it a sin tax when you have a high tax on alcohol, cigarettes, cannabis, things like that.
Understandable, all the fun stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, yeah, those are really all my questions. For episode 2, I just wanted to touch on big differences between the other states. I really only covered Colorado in my first episode. So I want to talk about Washington. I want to reach out to Illinois as well. I have an interview with someone from Oklahoma on Monday because I want to, get interviews from the states that aren't, California or Colorado, basically.
Yeah, the big differences here, no out-of-state ownership, no vertical integration, and basically a finite number of licenses on the producer-processor side and the retail side. And with fewer stores, the licenses have more value, right? Because they're limited. So like the teen issues, teens do not buy in retail stores in Washington. I think we have the lowest rate in the country. It's lower here in cannabis than alcohol because nobody's going to risk their license. So a lot of these regulatory decisions have, an effect of how the market operates. some intuitive, some counterintuitive.